degree by a philosopher named Heidegger. And Heidegger considered himself a student of being. And for Heidegger, the main mystery of the world was why it existed. And the best way to think about he was a phenomenologist, and the best way to think about phenomenology and existentialism is that phenomenology is the study of experience as it's lived. And then existentialism puts a twist on that, because existentialists assume that being has a implicitly moral dimension. And the existentialist psychologists presume that pathology, at least in part, is a consequence of a disturbed relationship, a disturbed moral relationship with the self and being. It's very tricky thinking, and it's not often handled in personality courses anymore, but I think that's a big mistake, the phenomenological element in particular. The thing I really like about it is that it's a really good counterpart to modern materialistic viewpoint, because it puts consciousness at the center of being instead of treating it as if it's something that's a secondary phenomena that emerges from something else. And our modern presuppositions, especially the scientific presuppositions, or what pass for scientific presuppositions, are generally extremely reductionist, and they assume that consciousness is in some manner that's not yet been determined, like a secondary byproduct of fundamentally material processes. And it's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis, but I wouldn't say there's any real evidence for it. I mean, it's hard to overstate how mysterious consciousness is as a phenomena. For Heidegger, consciousness was a mystery that was in some sense equivalent to the mystery of being. And the reason for that was that he couldn't conceive of existence without a subject. So you can imagine if the world was stripped of consciousness, it's very difficult to describe what would be left. I mean, if you take a very straightforward materialistic viewpoint, you could make the presumption that if everything that was conscious was eradicated, then things would be just the way they are now. But I think that's a shallow viewpoint, because consciousness is what gives everything a perspective. It gives it a size, and it gives it a duration, and it gives it colors and all the qualities that we associate with being. And without that, consciousness, all that's at least incomprehensible. And then there are deeper problems that are dealt with by people like John Wheeler, who's a quantum physicist, who believes that consciousness is necessary for quantum indeterminacy to resolve itself into something that's concrete and actual. So Wheeler, and many physicists like him, put consciousness at the center of the process that turns potential into actuality. Now, at the same time these quantum ideas were being developed, these philosophical ideas and psychological ideas that I'm describing were being developed. And they provide such a different take on the structure of reality that I think they're indispensable. I also think they're interesting in relationship in particular to Piaget's thought, because the phenomenologists have a constructivist element to their thinking, in that they believe that consciousness plays a constructive role in the establishment of being. So we're going to look at being. So again, the way to think about this is you've got to flip your viewpoint in a sense. Is you have to think about your experience as reality, and that everything that's inside that experience, so to speak, as a subcomponent of that reality, instead of thinking of material things as the reality and your experience somehow emerging out of those. It's an inversion of what constitutes the fundamental reality. And so you could think about it in a sense as an intellectual exercise. I mean, most of the way that people think is predicated on some kind of implicit set of axioms. And if you change the axioms, you can often shed light on reality in a new and interesting way. And so we're going to walk through the phenomenological viewpoint, and we're going to see why and how that might be interesting, the phenomenological and existential viewpoints. And then in the next lecture, I'm going to put a twist on that, because what you think about the nature of reality appears to have some powerful relationship with how that reality unfolds itself. And the existentialists, the phenomenologists, were very big believers in the reality of subjective experience, and the existentialists were very big believers in the ethical responsibility of the individual. And I'm going to talk to you about what happened in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959, which is a period of world history that isn't well covered in our culture. I mean, everybody knows about the Nazi Holocaust, but very few people know that between 30 million and 60 million people were killed as a consequence of internal repression in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. That's a figure that's 5 times as big as the commonly held figures for the Holocaust. And the reason I'm going to introduce that to you is, first, you should know about it, because it's the stellar example of what happens when people abandon their individual responsibility. And second, and related to that, it's an object lesson in what happens when the presuppositions that the phenomenologists and the existentialists held about the nature of reality were completely dismissed in favor of a rationalist utopianism. And rationalist utopias, ideologically rational utopias, killed millions and millions of people in the 20th century. And it seems to me that you can make a fairly powerful case that if your view of reality, when it's played out in the social world, turns genocidal time and time again, there's probably something existentially wrong with it. And then a second derivation of that might be, if there's something that existentially wrong with a viewpoint, in what way can you consider it tenable, even if it makes sense and it's rational? If the outcome is genocide and deceit and misery, it's perfectly reasonable to presume that that's evidence that it's wrong.